Tonight, I'm very happy to introduce you to Justine Orlovsky Schnitzler. She earned her undergraduate and graduate degree from Carolina. In 2017, she earned a double major in history and women's and gender studies. And in 2021, so this year, an MA in folklore with Gabi Berlinger, who's here with us tonight as well. And she is the first and as far as the only master student who earned also a Jewish studies certificate. So we are very proud of her. Her master's thesis is what will be the content what she's talking about tonight. Last year, she was also a fellow with the college's Humanities for the Public Good initiative, and she served as an editorial fellow with its Southern Cultures magazine. 2 years ago, she served in our center as the Lori and Eric Sklatt graduate student intern, and she worked there on outreach initiatives and helped us grow the graduate student network. She is also a columnist to the Jewish Women's Archive and a contributor to other publications, including Lilith magazine and the Jewish Book Council. Justine, I'm really happy to hear you. And as you know, Yiddish is very dear to my heart, and I'm very much looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much. Just for context, Ruth had the pleasure of attempting to teach me Yiddish. So I made it through that, and so I'm very prepared for this. Ruth is a wonderful teacher. That is a knock on me. Should I just get going? Is there anything else I need to do? And then we'll pull up the PowerPoint. Okay. Let's see. There it is in the corner. It's gonna get bigger. Okay. Everybody's good. I assume folks can see PowerPoint, so I'm just gonna start. I don't want to waste too much time here. Hello, hi everybody. Thank you for coming. First and foremost, there are a lot of things you can choose to do on a Monday evening, so I'm very glad that you've chosen this. As Ruth said, my name is Justine Orlovsky Schnitzler, and I graduated this past August with a master's degree in folklore and a graduate certificate in Jewish studies. And over the course of the 2-year program, I researched Yiddish music with an emphasis on partisan and resistance music as performed for a modern audience. And I conducted an ethnographic study of the Boston Workers Circle Community Chorus, which is called a Besser Welt. Many of you on the call are part of a Besser Welt, so this is no surprise to you, which means a better world in Yiddish. So in this talk, I'm going to speak as briefly as I can manage it. We'll see how we do on timing, about the scope of my research, the questions that I took into this work, and the conclusions that I drew, in the hopes of getting you excited about the world of modern Yiddish song and performance that I truly believe is very instrumental in the ongoing work of building Jewish futures. And again, many of you on this call actually sing this music. You're in a Besser Welt, or you're a Besser Welt adjacent. So I feel like I'm starting off on a strong note. I might not have to convince you too much. My thesis project, and you can see it there on the screen, is entitled Mir Seinen Do, Yiddish Music, American Jewish Identity, and the Promise of a Jewish Future. The phrase, of course, means we are here, and it comes from a verse in a very important partisan song that many of you are undoubtedly very familiar with, Zog Die Kenmo, colloquially known as the partisan song. And I drew from a combination of original interviews with current members of a Besser Welt across a wide age range. I pulled from different folklore and related interdisciplinary research, and primarily Yiddish source material. So if you want to move to the next slide. There we go. First, to ground this work historically, I think it is important to note that on the eve of World War II, there were an estimated somewhere between 10 to 12 million Yiddish speakers around the world. And after 1945, there were fewer than 1 million. So in addition to being this mother tongue and everyday language for a majority of Europe's Jewish population for hundreds of years, Yiddish was itself a kind of statement of identity, an organizing tool that buoyed many of these radical leftist Jewish populations that were flourishing prior to the war. And many of these pockets of armed organized resistance, these partisans, aforementioned partisans, to the Nazi regime were Yiddish speaking. And so that itself is a kind of statement of solidarity. And for then anyone who does not know, partisans are members of irregular military units, so they're not belonging to organized units of a nation state, but instead revolutionaries, counterforces, community-based fighting units. So Jewish partisan groups, they existed all across Europe. You don't really hear too much about them in standard Holocaust education and World War II education more broadly, which I find to be a tragedy. We could spend an entire different talk outlining and organizing, but they were very active, right? These are folks who were derailing Nazi supply trains, passing messages between people trapped in ghettos and those on the outside, collaborating with Allied armed forces, stockpiling weapons, et cetera, et cetera. The legacy of Jewish resistance, as I said, is often dwarfed by the legacy of Nazi violence. But many of these people composed songs and poems in Yiddish that were then set to music, survived the war, and have had this kind of second life in a politically radical Jewish spaces in the US. And they take on new meanings in the process. So as a folklorist, one of my central questions and concerns is the ways in which tradition is created and transformed, both in relevance and in purpose, and how meaning, particularly political meaning, is contextually determined. And so to sing this music today is you're calling upon a very specific well of strength from a particular period in Jewish history. And so one of the major questions I came into this research with was, what makes singing these songs so poignant for contemporary Jews, giving them a life that exists beyond their original audience through this continued performance? Which I believe that last sentence is, yeah, it's bolded there. For me, the PowerPoint screen is very, very tiny, so I'm having to lean much closer than I think I would normally, but we'll go ahead and move to the next slide. There we go. And so ultimately through this thesis, I'm arguing that through this repeat public performance and interpretation of partisan and ghetto songs, that members of the Besser are creating a conduit, right, between past and present time. Every graduate student's favorite phrase, liminal space, that fosters a promise of Jewish futures. And, a deeply layered study of this chorus, again, many of you on this call are in this chorus, would mean that you could take years creating a really comprehensive ethnography. And I'm going to rely on some quotes from members that I interviewed. It's just a small sample size. I wish I could write a book on a Besser Rebel, and who knows, I might. But for the purposes of this, we're focusing on small representations of political affiliation and relationship to this music. But I do think that this is an important snapshot of how many members of Besser Rebel understand their Jewishness in the context of radical Yiddish inheritance. So small in scope, but I think gestures at something much larger. Please move to the next slide. Okay, so very briefly, talk about Yiddish, right? Again, something many of you are undoubtedly very familiar with, but Jonathan Ross, when he was writing for the New York Times, said that the destruction of Yiddish-speaking Jews in Europe was a lesson in the dangers of statelessness, vulnerability of exile, an element of a contradictory appeal, which is that it allows young Jews to reach into the past, the Holocaust, for a living culture, even if it bathes them in so-called soft aura of victimhood. Now, this is a very controversial statement. I won't say this without context. This idea that Yiddish culture beyond the Holocaust could not be divorced from the Holocaust itself, it creates this kind of contradictory blank slate. And this bounced around in my head for many days after I read it. And during this research and this writing process, I had to ask myself continuously, what do I want Yiddish to mean, and how is this impacting the research that I'm doing? Is a familial, historical, or religious connection a necessity for learning Yiddish, insofar as it gives you some kind of intangible, impossible to describe emotional tether, which is what I would have said before I embarked on this process. Can Yiddish ever be anything but a Jewish language for Jewish people? And so in the context of working in this folklore discipline, I was really eager to understand what possibilities and limitations existed for singing Yiddish partisan music in the United States. I mean, thinking about our own geography and our own Yiddish history here, it can change and shape these boundaries of remembrance, of reverence, of connection, all of which is to say, another major guiding question, are the members of a Besser Rebel attempting to bring back something that can't ever exist again, or are they building an entirely new Yiddish land, right? A world of culture, of language, of political dreams, of ambitions. It's entirely separate and divorced from where Yiddish land previously existed. And I think it is important, of course, to note that there's a lot of debate amongst Yiddishists and Jewish historians more broadly about whether you can even experience, or rather characterize Yiddish as experiencing a revival when the language has never fallen out of use, right? There are close to 1 million Yiddish speakers today. They do primarily tend to be folks in rather insular religious pockets of Jewish life. So you kind of have this idea that Yiddish is synonymous with Orthodox Judaism and that there is a secular Yiddish that no longer exists. But it doesn't necessarily indicate a problem, right? And so I was hesitant to put this label of a revival on Yiddish. And again, that is itself could be an entirely different talk as well. But for the purposes of this, I think it's important to know that Yiddish, in many cases, can and should rise above denomination of a religious Jewish identity. And I think here, yeah, I'll have you skip to the next slide. Thank you. So one of my interviewees, Sonia Taff of the Besser Welt, ruminated on Yiddish's American reputation as this vehicle of humor and dramatic emotional highs and lows, which many of you are undoubtedly familiar with as well, saying, of course, a lot of Yiddish has come into English as invective forms in local, colorful, theatrical language, which is why I made myself obnoxious in the chorus last year by saying, we should do an entire concert in Yiddish love songs because you can do a lot more in Yiddish than just curse at people, right? Even though the curses are admittedly absolutely fantastic. I loved this quote. I wanted to change my entire thesis focus after getting to this point. Again, so many different avenues you could take this down. And for the purposes of this project, though, it is really most important to understand how Yiddish speakers who sing in a Besser Welt relate to and understand the language themselves. So Norm Berman, who's a child of Holocaust survivors, summarized Yiddish thusly. Yiddish was our mama lotion. It was the currency of our conversation and our culture and everything else. It elevated it in a way. It wasn't just the language that we brought with us when we came to the States, and then there was this pressure to assimilate. It was something to hold on to because it was something in our core. It was how we could truly speak to each other. Pause very briefly to take a sip of water here. Back to Sonia. I do think of it as a political language. I tend to associate it with the left wing. I know that Yiddish speakers and socialists are not in a perfect overlap, but I tend to think of it oddly in some ways. It's a ghost language, but nonetheless, I don't think of it as backwards looking. I don't think of it as reactionary. I seem to have come out personally thinking of it as a very contemporary language. And part of this is self-selecting the people I know who engage with it. But I do it as both an act of remembrance and an act carried forward. I think you can skip here to the next slide. Here we go. Of course, I'm looking at this now and thinking, I should have varied out the different, I should have moved the red logo over at some point so you have a little bit of variety, but you're bearing with me. So to briefly introduce the Besser Welt, of course, we've gotten this far into this talk and haven't really talked about the org itself. The chorus was formed in 1997 at the Workers' Circle Center for, well, previously the Workmen's Circle, now the Workers' Circle, for Jewish Culture and Social Justice in Boston. It's a community space founded over 100 years ago by Jewish immigrants, which is primarily focused on cultural engagement, preservation, and political action. The mission, Jewish Culture for a Just World, is springing from a desire for solidarity in an unfamiliar and largely hostile country. So a Besser Welt is actually not the only Workers' Circle affiliated Yiddish chorus in the history of the organization, and undoubtedly not the only Yiddish speaking group that sings songs in the United States, but it was the first one formed after this period of closures nationwide for many formerly thriving Workers' Circle branches. And unlike more traditional and religious synagogue spaces, the Workers' Circle is thinking about Jewish identity as a cultural rather than religious inheritance, which is not to suggest that it exists in opposition to religious spaces, right? Many folks I talk to who are part of a Besser Welt also belong to shuls. It's just that the circle and the shul satisfy different, but often overlapping needs of social, communal, spiritual nature. I think you can move the next slide here. Here we go. Finally, we have some photos. I'm critiquing my PowerPoint in real time. Why a Yiddish chorus, right? So many members of a Besser Welt described song, especially communally shared song, as a medium that feels both accessible and inherently rich. So Norm Berman again remembered joining a Besser Welt with his young daughter in the hopes of sharing the language in a way that didn't feel instructional or mandatory. He said, I joined a Besser Welt 1 year after it was officially founded. I think I read about it in a Jewish newspaper. And there was just a little piece at the bottom that said the Yiddish Chorus Circle. And I thought, oh my God, this would be a wonderful thing. I had grown up speaking Yiddish. It was actually my first language. And so it was exciting for me, but it was also for my daughter, Rachel, who was 9 at the time. I'd been looking for a way to introduce her to Yiddish. I felt that there was a richness there, something of value. It's hard to take a child and sit down and say, look, I'm going to teach you Yiddish. But the notion of it being an activity we could do together struck me as a way to make that introduction. So I told her, look, you and I are going to do this one thing. We're going to go join a chorus. You can skip ahead. Thanks. Man, I packed these with quotes. Look at this. Look at all this text on the screen. So every member, almost every member, I should say, of a Westervelt that I interviewed for this project made a point to suggest the Yiddish language functions as this conduit through which you can express Jewishness, but also a symbol of Jewishness and radical politics in and of itself, for themselves and also for non-Jews. Linda Gritz said, for us, our Yiddish, again, radical Yiddishkeit, it's our whole ethnic identity. We don't have a religion. The radical Yiddishkeit is our ethnic identity. Someone can say they're Italian, someone can say they're Greek. We're Jewish ethnically, and we have a sense of social justice rooted in that tradition of the Enlightenment of the 1800s. I won't read the entire quote here in the interest of time, but the very end she mentions as well, I recognize that I'm picking and choosing my piece of Yiddish. Move to the next slide. And here's a quote from Rebecca Long, a younger member of a Westervelt, under 30, saying, it feels genuinely Jewish to want to sing in this choir, because these are songs, for example, the old labor songs that people really sang. These are songs from the Vilna Ghetto that people really sang. And it feels like tapping into this culture in a deeper way than even going to synagogue for me, where I'd be reciting prayers in languages that I don't fully understand, saying things I don't fully agree with. This is the language of the shtetl, revolution, a language that was really close to being murdered, now being resurrected for this radical purpose, which she sees as very inspiring. I would skip ahead here. Here we go. Derek, this is the moment where I'm going to start tapping into your quotes, so cover your face and hide it if you're concerned. But don't worry, I don't think too many folks can see you here. So to talk about folk expressions of Jewishness, there's something to be said for the dynamic nature of folk and folk expression. So each and every Jewish person can express their Jewishness in a way that's unique to them. Even when you're operating from the same script, like in this case, sheet music used by members of a Westervelt, the Torah at Saturday services or Siddur, there's guaranteed subtle variations in execution. It's not humanly possible to produce perfectly synchronous sound when you're singing as a group. You can't read from the Torah every time with the exact same inflection and pitch and breath. You can't move through the prayers in a Siddur at precisely the same speed every week. And so for members of a Westervelt, the nature of the group achieves harmony through individual expression, right? So you have these defined, unique roles for singing in various voices, alto, soprano, etc. But when a Westervelt performs Zogny Kainmol, they produce this coherent expression of Jewish resistance, which is assembled from voices of dozens and dozens of unique Jewish individuals. So many members of Westervelt identified political relationships to and with Yiddish as this motivation to engage with the chorus. You're enacting and espousing these values and engaging with tradition in a way that feels, and here I'll quote, true to a political compass. So Derek David, Westervelt's current musical director, said, I know for a lot of people in the chorus, it's very much an affirmation of their history, their identity, their values. In other words, what we do is very much so a declaration of what we believe. It's both a representation of our personal history and its way of expressing leftism, Jewishness in the same breath. For him personally, I also see what we do as taking part in a historical act as we recreate this past to sing for a more just and equitable world and to sing for voices that have been silenced and suppressed in the world today. I won't continue to read all of it again in the interest of time, but here you can really see the connection of liminal space. You're starting in the past, you're thinking in the present, you're acting in the present, but you're also looking toward the future. So if you would skip slide here. Thank you. And I included a photo, Derek. Man, I am so sorry. David's perception of how Westervelt's members may understand their politics in relation to and in conversation with Yiddish, it really provides a valuable lens. I mean, this was really invaluable for me as a researcher. So you're talking about this discovery, this rediscovery, honoring the past, potentially keeping it alive. It's the same sentiment that pretty much everybody I interviewed had. There is something worth preserving in the words and melodies of Yiddish, whether it's sung in memoriam, in hopefulness, or just for the present. And so as we closed that interview, I was pressing David to summarize his thoughts on the Westervelt's repertoire and the relevance of Jewish partisans in the 21st century. And of course, at the time when I conducted these interviews in the year 2020 more specifically. And he said, what I would say is the Jewish partisan repertoire is not the only thing we do. Part of the reason why I'm here, my goal, my mission is to promote this historical contemporaneous Yiddish music, as well as to add to the tradition through my own arrangements and compositions. I'm here not only in support of this left-wing ethos of the group, but on this personal artistic mission of promoting art that's been lost and creating art that has yet to be born. I meant to bold that text, but I will underscore it here as I read through it now. In my eyes, I try to provide formal arrangements of the folk songs in addition to folk arrangements in an effort to celebrate and honor this Yiddish musical world that had been so cut down. So it's important here, radicalism is not inherent to Judaism nor the Yiddish language, but as Mike Katz eloquently notes, music of ghettos and Jewish partisans that a Westervelt performs showcase radical Jews who are willing to write about their circumstances, their experiences, and their dreams. He said, for us, and this is much more philosophical, part of the reason Yiddish is important to us as people, you may notice that neither of us said that we went to Hebrew school. The traditional religion is not part of either of our families. How do you keep a culture alive? To me, it's Yiddish and Yiddishkeit. Let's skip next slide here. So an anthropologist, Roy Rappaport, has said, a ritual is an order of acts and utterances, and as such is enlivened and realized only when these acts are performed and those utterances are voiced. They are participating in, that is, becoming part of, the order to which their own bodies and breath give life. So this idea of becoming through performance seemed particularly salient to me. A Westervelt is not just sharing the music of partisans and ghetto resistors with an audience, but also with themselves. And in this sense, each performance is this act of creation, of memory, of space. And a Westervelt really revels in this in-betweenness. Here we go with the liminal space again. I have a little graphic there, it might be hard to see, but this concept of betwixt and between, it's relevant here. So to rely on Norm Berman again, he described to me what happens in the room when a Westervelt sings. In performance, there are these moments where you suddenly feel, oh my God, we've made this connection. We've succeeded in creating this space. And it's not that we're suddenly in the camp or in the woods, meant to be woods, or in the shtetl, but we're in that emotional space where we can connect with what our ancestors experienced. We can actually bring that experience to each other, to ourselves, but also to the people who are listening to us. I think with a good performance, especially when you know the harmonies work and the timing is working, you just walk into it and it happens. And I've been told by members of the audience, oh my God, in this particular song at this particular moment, something happened. And so here, Westervelt is creating the most ordinary and extraordinary of places, liminal space. And the boundaries of time get a little fuzzy. It's not quite time travel, but it's a way, forgive the pun since we're on Zoom here, to zoom out and to see Jewish experiences on this long continuum with no real beginning or end. You can move to the next slide. So talking about Jewish futures, a Westervelt liminal space and performance is not just grounded in remembrance of the past and the creation of Jewish present, but in that promise of Jewish futures, as I said. And for Linda Gritz, this promise is made most visible by the involvement of young kids. She said, I cry, especially when the kids sing. It's expressing my heritage, my ethnic identity, my aspirations for a better world. Similarly, Rebecca Long told me, there's an eerie familiarity about Yiddish. It feels like mine. And so I think in deepening my understanding of Yiddishkeit by singing, that I have found meaning and have also gained understanding of things I never would have expected Yiddish to apply to. It's cool to understand just how modern this language is in so many ways, how I can imagine a world in which the Holocaust never happened and people were still speaking Yiddish in huge numbers. I'm in this chorus with mostly 60-plus-year-olds. Sorry to anybody who's not 60-plus on this call, but is a member of a Westervelt. And to learn from them and sing with them feels very meaningful. And just to see the younger people, there's a hope that I feel that, when this generation is no longer here, this fire still exists. And so looking at the conversations that folks who are several generations removed from this direct trauma of the Holocaust are saying, ooh, we lost the slide. Nope. People are careful to, they're avoiding idealizing Yiddish speakers and the politics of Jewish people more broadly. But people, they're seeing a Besser Welt as this way to keep this fire lit. And it's a way to involve themselves firsthand in this creation of Jewish space for a future, not just an exercise in nostalgia. And so I think it's particularly poignant to contrast the emotional involvement and a sense of place and belonging between the oldest and youngest generations who perform with the Besser Welt. Both have a sense of the future as something that you never really reach. The promise of a Jewish future to me, and what I took away from this research, is surrendering to the hope that the things that were meaningful to the people who called themselves Jews will live on in places and spaces that Jews are, by virtue of our limited time on earth, prevented from ever seeing, right? It's an old adage, but I think it's a true one, that tomorrow never arrives. And that's a precarious sense of peoplehood, but I think it's deeply, deeply embedded in Jewish self-mythology. As we all know, Moses could not enter the promised land, but he could glimpse it. And the faith that the people he had led out of Egypt, the people who became Jews, had a future. And that's it. Thank y'all.
I have to unmute myself. Justine, großen Dank. Thank you very much. If you have questions, you can either raise your hand. This is you find this under the reactions, or you can just put this in the chat. Either way, we will take the questions. I'll look around to see if I see someone who's raising the arm, and yeah, Ken.
Okay.
Okay.
Ken, I think you unmuted yourself and then accidentally muted yourself again. Would you mind? There you go.
My question is, why identify Jewishness with the left? The left is so failed today, it doesn't make sense to me. In England, the Labour Party is anti-Semitic. In the United States, the woke people are anti-Semitic. Every communistic and socialistic regime has failed. The ones that are still around with the name are dictatorships with free markets. So why continue to make this, what I think is deleterious and unnecessary connection with Jewishness and the left?
Well, that is a huge question. It's hard to know where to start. I mean, in the interest of brevity and doing the best I can to respond to this now, I would say, I'm pulling from the identification of the folks of this particular group. And I think it would be difficult to answer it without asking, why does a Besser Welt exist at all? And that might be beyond the scope of my thesis, unfortunately. I know that's not necessarily a satisfactory answer, but this is an ethnography of leftist Jews. So yeah, I'm not sure how to get to the bottom of that without taking us much farther back than I think we might have time for today.
Can I just say something to that? Because it doesn't sound like it has anything to do with left-wing Jewishness per se. I just heard sort of like an attack, sort of like an ad hominem attack on the left. I didn't hear anything specifically about Jews or an association of leftists and Judaism or anything of that nature.
Can I respond to that? Specifically, the Labour Party is anti-Semitic. The woke people are anti-Semitic.
I mean, these are your opinions, and they're sort of a non sequitur to her research.
Well, but there is evidence along those lines.
It's a non sequitur to her research.
Ken, I really think that I would like to take another question, and I think it is definitely a broader question which needs to be addressed. But that's but let's go back to the Besser Welt. And Michelle Rifkin-Fish has a question, and she said, "I'm interested in the process by which the choir chooses songs, debates over these choices, and whether you have heard them discuss specific songs in terms of content, historical significance, musical characteristics, etc." And she thanks you for a wonderful talk.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so absolutely. And of course, I have Derek David on this call, who is the musical director for Besser Welt. So this is a conversation that he and I had a couple of times. And of course, I'm not going to cheat and ask him to answer this question for me. That would be, that would certainly not be acceptable. But I can tell you, yeah, this is certainly something that I talked about with many members of the chorus, because I think it is important to underscore, certainly, as I mentioned, but perhaps maybe not aggressively enough. This is not the only music that a Besser Welt sings, right? This was the lens in which I'm taking a look at the chorus, the specific music, the partisan, the resistance music. But I attended their spring concert, which feels like it was yesterday, but somehow was, I think, almost 4.5 months ago now. And of course, you know, we're hearing a variety of Yiddish songs. We're hearing songs that were not originally written in Yiddish being sung in Yiddish, right? I heard a phenomenal rendition of We Shall Overcome. And certainly that is keeping with the politics of the group, but again, not the only music that they sing. I remember that Derek told me that in many ways they're more democratic than many other choruses may be, insofar as there are plenty of choruses in which the members do not have input at all into the music that they sing. But given that this was a chorus that was started because of the interest of folks in the worker circle, there were original suggestions that are still sung today. I think that there is, you know, there's conversation and discussion amongst members and of course the musical director of what feels relevant in this moment. And of course, it's not a short process by any means. Learning arrangements, creating arrangements, having them actually learn the music. And then you throw something like COVID into the mix, where I did attend one of their rehearsals, and unfortunately on Zoom, that makes it extremely difficult to sing live and practice. So everyone is muted except for Derek, and folks are you can see their mouths are moving as they're singing at home. But I think they've done an admirable job of that. I may have gotten a little bit away from your question there. I need to open the chat myself, but I hope that gives you kind of a general sense of the fact that this is a conversation, right, that's happening between the members and then also, you know, musical directors. So thank you for the question. That was wonderful.
And Bill Ferry says another question, and then Bernie, I will take you next. Bill's question is, what drew you to this topic? Do you sing yourself? And if I may add, my own question is, why Boston?
Why Boston? So what drew me to this topic, I cannot sing. I should have said that first. I mean, I feel like a bit of an imposter, and I certainly felt that way during some of my interviews where folks had the same question, right? People that are singers wanted to know, but I'm an appreciator of music. I certainly don't think you have to be able to sing to do so. But what drew me to the topic more broadly, I mean, I've been interested in Jewish expressions of political aspirations for a long time. Somebody who's a Jewish person, somebody who's interested in the history of the political left, it seemed like kind of a natural outgrowth. And I think it was a very interesting way of expressing political aspirations and ambitions and hopes and dreams. And then really on top of all that, in terms of why Boston, and of course, she's on the call as well, and I will not deflect to her either, but my editor at the Jewish Women's Archive is a member of Besser Welt. And so despite the fact that I'm in North Carolina and they're in Boston, I was introduced to the group by that connection, and it just felt very natural to make them the focus of this research because they were so welcoming and so open to being research subjects. So yeah, that's the answer, hopefully to both of those.
Thank you, Bernie.
How does a Besser Welt feel about sharing their arrangements with some other Jewish groups? Like we have a triangle Jewish chorale here, and it happens to be led by a non-Jew, but we're they sing a lot of things in English by Jewish composers, and I'm trying to move them towards more Yiddish. But if we can get some free arrangements, that would help us, I think. So how inclined is your group or a Besser Welt for sharing stuff?
Okay, well, so I said I wasn't going to rely on the musical director who's on this call, but I do think he might be the best equipped to answer that question, Derek.
Well, being leftist, I think that we are inclined to definitely share. I think it just depends on what it is. There's stuff that are completely, I think, for the world to sing, in which we sing ourselves. I think there's some things that are copywritten. I think some of the stuff that I've done, I would just want to talk to, who else is going to program it or involved, just to see. But yeah, I think we're very open to that and spreading music and spreading the love.
Who do we contact?
Why don't you shoot me an email? I'll put it in the chat for you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think we have, there's a really wonderful follow-up question from Patricia asking whether the choir ever goes on tour and if you interact with Yiddish choirs and musical groups in Europe as well. But maybe not only the triangle, but also go beyond the triangle. And maybe Justine, you start, and then we maybe can bring in someone else.
Yeah, well, so certainly, and I did want to say too, I mean, the Workers' Circle is not just in Boston, right? There are active branches in different parts of the country. A Besser Welt is located at the Boston Workers' Circle. I can tell you that I know that they participate they have at least pre-COVID, I'm not sure where we're at with COVID in terms of their physical presence, but showing up at protests, right? Collaborating with other groups, showing up at events that align with the Besser Welt's political mission, especially in their community. I think that is important to say that they're very community-based. I don't know about traveling through Europe or going on tour. It didn't come up. I think that's a fantastic question, and I will give Derek a break since this is my talk. But if someone wants to throw it in the chat, if you're in a Besser Welt and you've gone to Europe to sing with Yiddish courses, please tell us, because that's fascinating, and I would love to know.
Derek, do you want to answer this?
Oh, sorry. Yes. We did go to, we perform around the New England area, although it's been quite a while since we've done anything due to COVID. But we've done things in neighboring New England states. The big thing we've done is we've gone to Yiddish New York, which is a Yiddish festival in New York. And we performed there in the 2019 winter program, and it was absolutely fantastic. And we did a program dedicated to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and that was a wonderful experience for all of us. We do know some of the other groups, some of which are in England, and we have been flirting with the idea of doing a joint collaboration where we could fly across the pond and have some fun, but these are just fantasies as of right now.
Yeah, and Michael put in the chat that you were thinking also to go to Eastern Europe, but the logistics seemed daunting, so you never know going forward. So that's lies in the future. Justine talked about as well.
Well, if you could just take everybody here and just everyone throws in $10 and we'll just see what happens and we'll start getting that going. And then aspirationally post-COVID, although that future seems farther and farther away, to be able to say those words, you never know, right? I think that's a hopeful note. And I do see in the chat, someone asked to see a sample or to hear a sample of the music during this presentation. I think that is a great comment. I did not embed the music because I have never shared audio on Zoom successfully. And in fact, of course, my delightful advisors who are on this call could tell you that I defended my thesis prospectus and thought that I was playing the music, and all of them were too polite to tell me that they sat very silently through that PowerPoint presentation. But I would really encourage you to look it up after we're on this call. And fortunately, they have an active YouTube page, and you can also view the spring concert and course. I believe the recordings are still available. If you, I'm seeing some nods here. It's accessible on the Workers Circle website.
Yeah, I'll put the link to the spring concert in the chat.
Thank you. Yeah, it's absolutely fantastic. It's absolutely lovely stuff.
Yeah, so please watch out for the chat. You will get some links, yeah, to an entire concert, and I'm looking forward listening into this. I try to see if there's anyone who has a question. And if you, I don't see anyone right now, you can unmute yourself and just speak.
Sorry to ask to ask a technical question, but my screen doesn't have the capability apparently of showing the chat room. Is there some secret way of pulling up the chat? I have share contents, participants, even more, but I don't have anything that, oh, I see it now. Okay, forget, erase that. I see it.
Okay, maybe click more, but you found it.
Yeah, I found it. Okay.
That's great. Oh,
yeah.
Well, you have a question there.
Sorry?
There's one in the chat. Ruth, somebody added something else.
Yeah, that's Marcy said, what's next for your professional life? And will Yiddish play a part?
I think that's a great question. I currently work in reproductive justice and access, but I continue to write for a variety of Jewish publications. And very excitingly, Duolingo, the language app, launched Yiddish this past year, which was, I can't speak to how good it is to learn an entire language from scratch through an app. I'm sure the language folks on this call would say, don't do that. But I'm still using it, which is fantastic. And I had a very memorable experience in Crown Heights a couple of months ago where I initiated a conversation with somebody and it didn't go fantastically. And it's hard to tell if it was because of the religiosity divide or because I was bad at Yiddish, but I'm counting it as a win. Opportunities to use it in a fluency kind of way are few and far between, but hopefully in the future, living in an area with more Yiddish speakers. But what's lovely is that it seems that folks are really interested in again, engaging with Yiddish, particularly, new younger folks who want to engage with the language, perhaps in a different way than folks did previously. And I think because of that, the media that's available in Yiddish will just continue to grow and grow, which is wonderful. And you'll have new literature, new songs, etc., to listen to and to participate with. So I would say yes, Yiddish will play a role. I'll keep you posted. If I ever finish the Duolingo language tree, we'll see. We'll see what's at the end of that. What actually happens then. But yeah.
And we're not going to discuss the accent because I know that that has evoked an entire huge debate on what the accent is. But anyway, no, I think I hope very much we can continue doing programs with Yiddish, but also on other topics. What I will do right now, I will share my screen and show you the upcoming talks of the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies, and I hope very much that we can see you here. Oops, sorry about this. So I hope that you can now see our next events. Thank you, Justine, very much for this wonderful talk, and thank you everyone who came to our event, and I hope very much that we can see each other in person very soon.